We will go ahead and just give an overview right now. For those of you who are new, it's a continuing class, and uh, my key phrase or theme is we're going to teach this course until Jesus comes. So that tells you I don't know when it is. I don't know if it's a week, a month, a year, or a decade, or whatever. But we're going to keep on teaching the Book of Revelation because it is more relevant today than it ever has been. In the Revelation, it starts out with the first line of the book gives us the title, as was done in the ancient writings. So it's the apocalypse, the unveiling, and so it's a matter of, well, you've probably seen like let's say a sculpture where an artist has a showing, he's got a cloth over, draped over it, right? And so when they finally come to a point, okay, he's going to show us the statue, and someone takes the cloth off, probably the artist, and now you see clearly what it is. That's what apocalypse or apocalypse, as we say in English, is. And so this is the unveiling of Jesus, showing us who he is and what is to come. So the book opens up with chapter 1, where we see the vision of him. And that vision is written down by John, who is the last living apostle. And I believe the end of the gospel, it says that the rumor went around because of what Jesus said, that John would never die. And he makes it plain. He said, not that I will never die, but I believe that that was fulfilled. So in other words, Jesus said that John would live to see the second coming, and he did. Not the actual physical event, but he saw it in the vision. In other words, he was transported there like in a VR headset or an IMAX, right? I mean, he was there. He saw the second coming. So Jesus prophesied it, and it occurred in that fashion, I believe. Morning. And so the apocalypse is the unveiling. It starts out in chapter 1, showing us the risen Christ. And the words that he spoke were written down. The first time John had seen him in 60 years. So as I've said before, people may not like some of the book of Revelation, or maybe they're apprehensive about studying it, but we have to keep in mind that it contains the last words of Jesus to the church. If you put it that way, do you like the book of Revelation? And they go, no. And then I kind of have to say, well, you don't want to hear what Jesus said, his last words to the church. Of course, it's only in chapter 1, 2, and 3 where we get more of a direct vision and the words for the church as such. But then in 4 and 5, those chapters, we see the heavenly scene, which is just in time, it's a split-second vision of what's about to unfold. They're getting everybody ready for what's about to happen. In chapters 6 through 19 is the actual tribulation, and it's broken down into 3.5 and 3.5. So the 3.5 and 3.5 is the time frame. So it gives us an exact time frame. All the events that occur here have never happened in history. Some scholars in the past have tried to fit it into early Caesars and what have you. But if you look at all the events realistically, and you compare to history, none of these things have happened. Right off the bat, the first event of the 7 years is the red horse. I should say the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse in chapter 6. That's the first event. And it says there that 1/4 of the world's population is killed. Well, given today's population of 8 billion plus, that's 2 billion. So the first thing I would ask somebody that says it's already been fulfilled, well, when did 2 billion people die? And in truth, in history, especially the time of the Caesars onward up until modern times, there weren't even 2 billion people in the world. So see how ridiculous that is. But and it's obviously literal. When God gives us definite figures, it's literal. It's not symbolic in any way. 1/4 of the Earth's population will symbolically die. That doesn't even make sense, but there were people, I guess, even today that believe that. There's a theology that came about by St. Augustine in 500 AD. That's like 1500 years ago, which was adopted by the Roman Catholic Church and others, not just them. But it's the idea of replacement theology and amillennialism, where they basically said that all prophecy that was for Israel would be fulfilled in the church, and particularly at that time, the Roman Catholic Church. So it kind of gave rise to a kingdom now theology where basically through the efforts of the Roman Catholic Church, again, it was the only church, the world would all become Catholic, and then the vicar of Christ, the vicar is like a placeholder, right? So the placeholder, who is the Pope, would hand the world over after it's been converted by Catholicism. The vicar of Christ would hand the world over to Christ. That's how St. Augustine phrased it. The problem is, and I could understand how they would think that, but the problem is that when you use the replacement theology, that Israel's no longer relevant, you run into 1948, where you have a big problem. 1948, Israel, after 1900 years, became a nation again. Same people, same land, even the same language that had not been spoken in 1,000+ years. So today, what's the center of the news? Almost every day, we got all kinds of news going on, but just about every day, pretty much now every day, if you turn on the news, you're going to hear a story about Israel. There's a reason for that. St. Augustine was wrong. There are people that believe it. I don't know how that's possible. You really have to have, you need help to misunderstand all that, because prophecy, the book of Daniel in chapter 9:27 gives us a time frame for the last tribulation, 7 years, and specifies 7 years. And it says the purpose of that was for Daniel's people, who were the Jews. There was no church at that time. And it says it was for the fulfillment, the culmination, the completion of all prophecy. So as you go back through the Old Testament and you look at all the prophecies, have all of them been fulfilled? No, they haven't. We have gone over many, and we'll go over many that are very specific in history, have never been fulfilled, and they have to be fulfilled by the Jews. So that's all to say that there is a proper interpretation of the scripture. I believe, this church believes, many Christians throughout the world believe that there are prophecies yet to be fulfilled. And many people don't realize it, but there's over 300 prophecies that were fulfilled by Jesus the first time. And the very first gospel, Matthew, I believe it was the first, seems logical. He was the guy that was responsible for working for the Romans to write down details in history. That's what he did, first guy to write it down. So being Matthew the tax collector, which was really like a clerk, we'd probably call him a clerk tax collector today. He would write down, some of these movies are accurate. He'd be at a table and there'd be a long line, and the Jews in a village would come to him and say, "What's your name? Who are you descended from? Who are your children? What do you do for a living? Especially how much money you make. Are you paying your taxes?" In other words, his job was to get money from the people for the Romans. That's why he was hated. Matthew and Zacchaeus and all the rest of the tax collectors were hated among the Jews. So the most hated Jew became at that time, the greatest writer of the gospel, the only gospel writer initially. And then the others continued. Mark was actually Peter's gospel, since Peter was probably illiterate as a fisherman at that time. And so he had Mark, many people believe was his nephew, the scholars believe, so had him write it down. That's Mark. And then when Paul went around, his physician Luke, hearing the stories from Paul and being in Jerusalem and no doubt meeting Mary and the rest of them, he wrote down the Gospel of Luke. And then last of all, John, we call the first three are synoptic. They're all from the same view. They're all pretty much the same. And I have a book from seminary, it's really good, where it has original language in all three Gospels. It's called a parallel. And everywhere there's parallel passages. And by the way, most of Matthew, Mark, and Luke have that. You'll see that they're all the same. But finally, at the end, John writes a gospel, no doubt after the others. And his gospel is very different. It's different than the others. So he gives us a much higher, loftier view of Christ than the other three. In other words, he was not so much interested in writing down the events, although he did, because they had already been circulated. Didn't have to duplicate that. He was interested in letting us know who Jesus really was, his higher purpose, and him as God. So he presents him as the God man. And so all that's to say, the first gospel, Matthew, starts out, and if you go back and read it again, think about this, trying to prove to the Jews, it was written in Hebrew initially, to the Jews, that Jesus was the Christ. And how did he go about proving that? First of all, with the genealogy. They all knew the Messiah had to prove that he was from the tribe of Judah. If you weren't Judah, there's a prophecy in Genesis where the prophecy states that out of the tribe of Judah, the scepter shall come. So they all knew the Messiah had to be from Judah. So you say, I really don't like all these begats I got to read, but although they may seem irrelevant to us today, at that time, if you didn't have that information, you could not have proven Jesus was the Messiah. So, and he did, and he constantly would go back, as written by Isaiah, as written by, whichever prophet. And so he went back, and the Jews, of course, knew from childhood all these prophets. And so when they read that, they realized that Jesus was the Messiah. So he had to prove to them. And many of them believed, and many did not. So but it's like today, you don't receive Christ because of intellectualism. Probably the guys with the most PhDs are the first guys going to hell. I'm being a little flippant, but I'm just saying, when your intellect is all you have, you're not going by your heart and your spirit, just your intellect. You might be a brilliant intellectual, but you're probably a humanist, an atheist, and who knows what. Could be a Satanist, but you're not going to be a follower of God. So, and you say, well, I don't believe that. Well, you just have to look at the 12 apostles. Most of them were fishermen. Almost all of them were fishermen. There was a tax collector, and there may have been a few others, but some of them, I don't know that we know the exact occupation they had. But there's only one guy who was the most educated. He was a scribe, and you have to know the culture back then. But the scribe would have been a very educated person, very, very educated. And guess who betrayed Jesus? The intellectual. Judas, the most educated, is the one, because Judas in his mind was trying to figure out how he could manipulate Jesus to get what Judas wanted. Judas wanted a high position in the Messiah's government. It's speculated. It makes sense. And so when he turned him in like that, Satan used it, but he energized his mind. But he was thinking to himself, Jesus, why don't you just come out and say who you are so we can get this thing over and take over, and I can live like a king, just like you. And so he said, well, I know what I'll do. I'll set him up, and then he has to manifest his power to everybody. Then they'll all recognize him as Messiah, and I'm going to be his right-hand man, being the most educated. There's been things written on that. It makes a lot of sense. That's what's happened. That's why when it all went south, as we say today, when Messiah was crucified, he said, oh my gosh, what have I done? I thought I was going to set him up and we're all going to be rich and live like kings. And now everything is, in other words, I betrayed the true man of God. So he killed himself. So that's how that happened. But anyway, all that's to say that Matthew wrote down the gospel and tried to prove it. As far as I'm concerned, he did prove it, and many of the Jews realized he proved it in the first century. So you say, well, what's that got to do with Revelation? Well, because if 300 plus prophecies, there's at least 33 that are so specific that there's no way one man could have fulfilled them, by the way. People say, oh, Jesus manipulated his own death, and then he just seemed to die. He didn't really die. He just swooned. These people are so ignorant. I don't care how many PhDs. They have no idea what the Romans did. The Romans are the most cruel people, and they invented crucifixion. And nobody, I mean nobody, survived crucifixion. The idea that Jesus didn't really die just shows how ignorant these people really are. But there's no end to what people, especially intellectuals, will try to conjure up under Satan's help to disprove Jesus. because the truth is that people are looking for an excuse not to believe. Any excuse will do. And if you've ever witnessed to people, you understand all the excuses oh yeah, but the Bible says this. What about this? They'll try to get you on rabbit trails and yes, sir.
Many of the intellectuals try to prove it by scientific proof. If it isn't based on some sort of scientific theory or experiment that proves it, that's their way of rationalizing their own intellect, and not so much through a spiritual understanding of.
Yes, sir. Mr. Kinney. I appreciate your input. Yeah, so that is all very valid. Yeah, so today people are entrenched in scientific method. There was no such thing at the time of the Gospels. Obviously, the Greeks and Archimedes and the rest of them had started to kind of invent science, but it was not a worldwide concept like we have today. So yeah, but there's many excuses. All that's to say that we study prophecy in the past because it really ultimately proves who Jesus was. I mean, you don't have to know all that to get saved. How many people were saved because of prophecy here? Me. I guess I'm the only one. So I was reading a prophecy book, and a friend of mine who I still talk to took me to a home Bible study, and I got saved there. But that was in spite of just graduating from the University of Miami with a degree in philosophy and religion, and of course all that was totally worldly and false. But so God had to really grab me and turn me around, because I was at the process of starting my own religion at that point. So no, I was a musician. I had a band, and I started a new band called We Are One, and we started playing around Miami, and I'd come on stage with a robe, and we'd play a whole thing I recorded about how there are many messiahs and many truths, and I know it sounds crazy, but I actually did that. So at that time, God said, no, that's enough. And he took me to this home Bible study, and I was saved by a high school kid, believe it or not, who, unlike all my professors, just kept on going back to what about this? What about this? He said this, what about this? And I finally God opened my eyes. I said, oh, I've been lied to for 4 years at the University of Miami. Anyway, not just there. I mean, they're all lying to everybody. So, but at any rate, that was an aside. Sorry for that. Let me keep going. So the prophecy is very important. I was saved because of it. Most people have not been, but I was an intellectual. I had to have something to hang my hat on. So that's what I was reading. And the thing is, the purpose of this class is to show what's coming in the future. It's the purpose of Revelation. And there are events, and there's definite details about what's coming, and it's possible to know these things. It's not telling us the date. It's not telling us exactly when they're going to happen, but they're going to happen. Just like in the time of Christ, there were many prophecies. Most people don't realize in Daniel, he was given the exact date Jesus would come into Jerusalem and be crucified. And there have been scholars who've broken that all down to the dates and everything, right to the Palm Sunday when he came in. So you say, oh, how come people didn't recognize it? Maybe two people recognized the general time. That was Anna and Simeon in the temple when Jesus was brought in on the 8th day to be circumcised. But in general, they didn't understand. But is it any different than today? How many people today realize that we're right on the door of Christ's coming? It's like, oh, we've always heard that. Yeah, my grandfather, everybody heard that. But the thing is, the things that are happening in the world today, and that's what I'm going to try to bring in as we go, are things that have never happened. The alignment of nations, everything that's going on today has never happened in the history of the world. Just starting off with Israel. Okay. Israel is the center of all prophecy. All prophecy is about Israel. No prophecy is about the church. Why? Because we're not going to be here. If we were, there'd be prophecy about us. And I go to links to show that. So the time it's coming, after a little intro there of chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, the time that's in the future is chapter 6 through 19. I mean, the majority of Revelation is the 7-year period. And so at the beginning, I've shown in the past, and be glad to go over it for anyone. The rapture is going to occur because there are no Christians on earth. God will immediately seal 144,000 Jews. No, they're not Jehovah's Witnesses. There's 12,000 from each tribe. So if somebody says, I'm one of the 144,000, ask them which tribe they're from, and then ask them to prove it. That's not going to happen. I got news for you. Yeah, if you buy that thing, then maybe I do have some swampland very close to me where I live. Yeah, that's the advantage of living in Florida. You actually can sell somebody swampland. Yeah, I live in well, I did a French drain. I dug down a couple of feet and water was there where I live in East Orlando. But I digress. So basically, the tribulation starts off. It's a 7-year period. It's divided into 3.5 and 3.5. The first 3.5 is different in character than the last 3.5. Not because I say so, because the word says it calls it the Great Tribulation, Thalipsis Megas, Great Tribulation, and it's greater in character. In other words, the extremeness of it is much greater. The judgments are much greater. The tribulation martyrs come along in the middle. There's always martyrs. There are going to be martyrs in the first 3.5 years, but the great amount of martyrs happens when Antichrist says, I'm God, worship me in the temple, and institutes a policy of, take the mark, believe in me, worship me. He's really wanting to worship. He doesn't care about the mark. He cares about worshiping him, because Satan has always wanted to be worshiped. Isaiah 14:14. I shall mimic. I want to be just like God. That's his fatal flaw. So Antichrist is his son, right? You have Satan the Father, Antichrist the Son, and you have the false Holy Spirit. There is no unholy spirit as such. There's the demons, of course, the fallen angels. So Satan the Father, Antichrist the Son, and the false Holy Spirit, demons, and the fallen angels going out into the world, acting kind of like the Holy Spirit. They're everywhere, right? Holy Spirit's everywhere. They're everywhere. So they're carrying out the will of the Father and the Son. They're carrying out the will of the Antichrist and Satan. So the whole thing is a false trinity. So again, Satan wants to mimic. Satan can't create anything. Satan's just a created being. He's already limited and defeated now. A being. He's out on bail. He's been at the cross. He's been convicted. Okay, the sentence has been carried out, and somehow God granted him a bail. I don't know how much money that was. He's on bail. He's out free, but his sentence and his fate is sealed. He's not going anywhere. Yes, sir.
Listen, help me understand this? The rapture came before tribulation, right?
Mhm.
Because God wouldn't put his people through that period of time of tribulation, because there was a lot of suffering during tribulation, right?
Well, it's more important than that. Revelation 3:10 says that he will save the faithful believers from the hour of tribulation. That's what it said. But it's a matter of the fact that this last 7 years is actually the completion of Daniel's prophecy for the Jews. And as I've taught before, at the end of the 7 years, in Zechariah 12, 13, and 14, which is the very last day or days of the tribulation, it says that the Jews will be held, a lot of them will be in Jerusalem, and they're going to look up and see him whom they pierced and recognize him as Messiah. So in other words, the whole idea is that Daniel was given a prophecy in chapter 9:27. Yeah, I mean, it's very short, but it's very definitive, where there's going to be 70 weeks. 69 weeks were literally fulfilled when he went into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, but 1 week is Shabuah in the Hebrew. It means a 7-year period. 1 7-year period is yet to be fulfilled, and that happens during, coincidentally enough, right? Just a coincidence, the 7-year tribulation period. So during this period, the main purpose of this period is to prepare the Jews to receive Messiah, which they've never done. That's the whole purpose of it. None of the things we read in the tribulation 6 through 19 have anything to do with the church. And in 19, we see the church coming back with Jesus on the white horses and the white robes, etc. I mean, I've gotten into a lot of depth in the past, and if you continue with the class, I'm going to touch on all those things again. At the very end, we're going to see, although I've covered the seals, which is the first 7 judgments, and I've covered the trumpets, and I will again. the second series of 7. At the very end, I believe in literally pretty much in the last weeks or months of the tribulation, we're going to see a recapitulation in a way of the miracles of Moses. Okay, maybe we can call them miracles. They actually were judgments of, they weren't miracles, but they were judgments of Moses. So, and I believe that in the Revelation in chapter 12, that when it talks about the two witnesses, chapter 11 and 12 through there, that those two witnesses are Moses and Elijah. And I've gone through in depth on there. Moses, because the miracles of the judgments that we're about to look here are similar to and very, some of them almost identical to the miracles of Moses. You say, well, he died, yeah, but they couldn't find his body, which is really strange because if you go over to Israel and take a tour, I haven't, but my sister's been over there many times. There is you can't go to the grave of Moses. You can go to the so-called grave of Abraham or Jacob. They have tombs and, and monuments. They can take you to these places. They can't take you to the grave of Moses. And the word says they couldn't find his body. So you can speculate. I speculate that God took his body for some reason and he's bringing it back. You say, well, what's the other proof of that? Well, it says that in the Gospels that when they went up to the high mountain, the mountain we call Transfiguration, there were two figures with him. And this is a picture of him coming back. This is the glorified Christ ahead of time, giving them a picture of what it's going to look like when he comes back. So who's coming back with him? Moses? And who's the other guy? Elijah. And who did the Jews, if you said to a Jew at that day, Moses and Elijah, what would they have said? Everyone to a man would have said, the law and the prophets. Remember the Pharisees? They said, we don't follow you, we follow the law and the prophets. So God has this sense of humor. When the Jews, that have rejected Christ are about to see him come back, they're going to see Moses and Elijah coming back, who have already been witnessing for 3.5 years. The reason that they are witnessing not just 144,000 is there's nobody else to witness. Says they stand before the Antichrist and witness to him. Well, is there any other parallel in Scripture? Go back to Moses. Who are the only two guys that stood before Pharaoh? How come the other Jews didn't stand before Pharaoh? Because they would have been killed. They would have been immediately taken off and, okay, get rid of this guy, get rid of this guy. Moses and Elijah will come back because they can stand before, and it says that no man can kill them. So they're witnessing for 3.5 years because there's no other witnesses on the earth directly to Antichrist. So that's how I know that. But at any rate, at least I believe that. If you believe differently, that's fine. This sores are one thing, seas to blood, rivers, blood, mankind scorched, beast afflicted, Euphrates, the earth. We have all these judgments that are going to come. I believe they're going to come very fast. Scholars believe, since these are like Moses's original, of course there was 10 originally, but these are 7 because there's 777 is the pattern of the judgments. But we don't need 10 here. I think these 7 will do it. They're so powerful. We don't need 10. But the first one is one that is sores afflicting those who accept the mark. By the way, the word says if people accept the mark, whatever that is. I have my own theories and I've espoused them. But whatever that is, when you take the mark, it's not just because you had a tattoo or you have an embedded chip or whatever it turns out to be. It's because of that part you have, I believe, somehow become a non-human. In other words, or as they are, I mean, you can Google this and see it's already very prevalent out there, transhuman. Transhuman means above and beyond human, and they're making transhumans right now. You probably never met one, but they're making it. Elon Musk is making one right now. He's in his second beta phase, where he's plugging in a interface into a person's brain that will be hooked to the World Wide Web, which will be much greater by then, and AI will energize it so the person will be smarter than any human in history. That's called transhumanism. somehow this mark is, you know, that concept on steroids. It's going to make people who take it superhuman. Maybe that's better than transhuman. They're going to be superhuman. And so, but once you take it, you can't rip it out. Whatever the interface is, you know, once you signed up for it, there's no going back. It's not coming out. Okay. That's why once you got the mark, you can't be saved. The word flat out says that. Those who take the mark, they're destined for judgment. So I think every Christian has heard of the mark, knows not to take the mark, and there's been speculation about what the mark is. I have told you in the past what I think it is, but it's not here yet. Don't get confused on that point. The developments, I call it the convergence, all the technology, and I work in the technology business. So all the technologies are coming into a single point I call convergence. It's not just my term, but when AI, robotics, and all of transhumanism all come together, then it's going to be the most powerful technology in history. And what makes any technology good or bad? Nuclear energy, what makes it good or bad? I can power a city or destroy a city. What makes it is the person who controls it. And when you have the son of Satan controlling that, then there's no escape. And it says so in the word. It says, you know, they tried to escape. God will help some of the Jews and others escape when he institutes the mark. But pretty much then it says, but who can make war against the beast? Who is able to overcome him? Nobody. Because of the surveillance system, they got one in China now, you can't escape. They are pioneering this system. So basically, once the surveillance system is enforced, it's going to take a miracle in the hand of God to escape from that system, because they see you everywhere. They know everything about you and everything you do. I know when I bought something the other day on Amazon, I signed into Google to look at something. My gosh, I got 3 ads for that thing.
Yeah.
They know everything about me. They know how old I am. They know my history. They know what I buy. They know who I'm married to. They know today. Can you imagine, like, whatever it is, 5, 10, 15 years from now, what they're going to be able to know about you? The idea of personal freedom is gone. You have no personal freedom unless you unplug from the off grid and run off into the desert. What do they call that? Bug out? Yeah. You got to go. You got to, yeah, that's a term, some bug out, where you go to some place like in the desert or the mountains where, you know, they can't find you theoretically. Of course they can. They got satellites. They can find you. But, you know, they wouldn't bother with low level guys. But in other words, today, they have enough technology today that if Antichrist came today, everything predicted could be implemented. But it's going to be way beyond that. But at any rate, continuing on, not to go too much longer, but the sea is going to be turned to blood and rivers. Okay, I like the 10 Commandments. Moses gets up, I think maybe it was Aaron. Was it Moses or Aaron? You guys correct me. I think it was Moses, but he dips his staff into the river, and it turns red. And it was a really great moment for Hollywood back in the 50s when they made that. And but you know, I'm sure that they were trying to depict, at least back then, they tried to be honest. They had a board of scholars and Jewish people and Christians who oversaw movies and made sure they're reasonably accurate. They don't do that today. And mankind's going to be scorched by the sun. So that could have a lot of meanings. It could mean in the natural that the sun will go nova, which means that there's a point in a star where it would actually increase in size and the radiation would increase. It's not beyond in the natural. Not.
Would you say global warming and the heating of the planet might be related to that?
Yeah, you know, we can't, we don't know. I don't know if any of that's really, you know, what it is. You know, I've listened to some experts in the weather field that have gone back in history, and you know, so-called warming that we have now was occurring, you know, 200 years ago, 500 years ago. So, you know, some of that's propaganda, some of that's real. But you know, I think a lot of these things are going to be supernatural, obviously supernatural, but there's some of the aspects will be like natural phenomena. I'm sure God will, as I've said before, I think some of this is God's saying to the world, of course, the Satan and all of these unbelievers, okay, you want to be God? I'm just going to go back here. I'm going to let you run the world. Let's see what you do with it. I really think that's a lot of it. God's going to say, have at it, boys. And when they have at it, remember at the end of chapter 6, they're in their caves and they're shaking their fist at God and saying, we hate you. Why have you done this to us? Oh, they're just ignorant. They don't know they don't know what's going on. Yeah, they all know what's going on. They know it's God, and they've made their choice against God, and their fate is sealed. And there's people like that today. You're going to meet them today. We call them reprobate. So they have made, their hearts are so hard, and they made such a decision against God that it's almost, if not totally, impossible for them to be saved. That's where we get that word from. But the Euphrates is going to be dried up. This happens, by the way, the day or maybe a day before the final battle of Armageddon, because what's going to happen, and I'll go into depth next time, is that the armies of the East, I believe it's going to be the United States of the East, headed by China, Korea, Japan, India, all those Eastern countries will have a confederacy. You say, well, why do you believe that? Because when the United States formed, Europe saw it, and now they formed not too long afterwards. I mean, it's a couple hundred years, but they formed their own United States of Europe. Does anybody know what it's called? The EU, European Union, is the United States of Europe. And the last to come into that realization and implementation will be the East. You say, I don't believe that. Well, in chapter 16, which is what we're studying, it says the kings of the East will march on Jerusalem and march on the Antichrist. So interestingly enough, in our time today, I'm seeing a lot of news, and I'm always listening for prophetic things, about China and about Taiwan and about how they, in fact, Putin and China, the President Xi of China, have just made a pact. They met last week. And I'm not saying that is it, but I'm saying it used to be that they were arch kind of enemies, old communist buddies, but also they threaten each other. And so that's all going away. And so you got North Korea, you have China and Russia, and Taiwan is the free China, but that could disappear. It's possible. And at any rate, however it's going to come about, it doesn't come about in its full-blown ability until the end of the 7 years. It's the last thing. In other words, what you say, well, what causes Armageddon? China causes Armageddon. They're not going to be involved in the initial things.
BRICS.
Oh yeah, the BRICS. Yeah, I thought you were talking about BRICS. Okay, the BRICS are coming together, and I went, BRICS? What kind of prophecy is that? I don't remember the prophecy of the BRICS. Oy vey. Right. Yeah. So Brother Jeff has some insights there. So yeah, the BRICS, BRICS, union, agreement, whatever. So yeah, so it's all, in other words, prophecy doesn't usually happen just bam, out of nowhere. It is an evolution, using that word in its true sense. It is a movement of things building and building and building. And we can look at World War II. If you look back, we know the history now of how Hitler came to power and how he was able to do what he did. All the signs were there. Some guys, some experts, some government leaders and military leaders were warning all the way. There were signs all the way. But, there was like Chamberlain in England, who thought, well, at any cost, we're going to go meet with Hitler and have peace. Well, that's kind of the way it always is. Every time there's evidences, there's building to something. There are voices who are saying, watch out. And then there's other voices who are saying, oh, we can appease them. But the problem is appeasement never works with dictators.
That's right.
But at any rate, so that's all to say that this was an overview of the 7 bowls, and we're going to next week go literally down all of the verses, and we're going to look at how China will, after I've researched how the route they would most likely take from China to the Mideast through Baghdad, and where the Euphrates is, and the 6 bowls. and down through the entire and finish. And we will look at where we're going, chapter 16, 17, 18, and 19. So in other words, yes, this is an overall study that has some detail in it, but hopefully along the way, I'm going to paint a framework. You'll see where does this fit into the overall framework of the book. There is a framework. There is a timeline, not an exact time, but a timeline. The book of Revelation is understandable, and things do occur in a time frame that one can analyze and I believe understand. Honey, will you wrap us up?